Hey, you're back! Welcome to week 4 of GB 102 Bible Backgrounds. I hope you're hungry today because in this lecture we're going to cover some of the basic facts of day-to-day life, namely food and sex. Sociologically speaking, the pursuit of sustenance and the drive to reproduce dominate our day-to-day existence. And it was little different for the ancient people of the biblical world as well. The difference between them and us, however, is worldview. Israel's God, through his inspired prophets, offered a comprehensive look at the subjects of food, famine, and fertility, and these biblical texts were often direct challenges to the beliefs of the surrounding pagan culture. So, if you're ready to begin another week of study, let's hit the trail and talk about some of the bare necessities of life. Now, I'm sure by this point in the class you've begun to realize the importance of land. The rocks under the ground determine whether or not an area is good for farmland. The location of a mountain can determine whether or not a field gets rain frequently or not. The presence of nearby enemies can determine whether or not a farmer will get an uninterrupted growing season. In short, access to the land and the ability to defend it was one of the most important aspects of biblical life. And it was no surprise, therefore, that God's first promise to Abraham was to give him a grant of land, saying, quote, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, go out from your country, your relatives, and your father's house, to a land that I will show you." And as the Abraham narrative progresses, God will promise more specifics about this land that he is to receive. Now, of course, this presents a problem. Since land is valuable, everyone, and not just the Israelites, want the best possible areas for themselves. And Abraham and his family, though they eventually became powerful, could not be called a nation by any sense of the word until the time of the Exodus and afterward. So, the questions of this basic meta-narrative is going to drive the first 1,000 years of the biblical story, all the way from the time of Abraham up until the time of David. And the question is this: will God make the Israelites into a powerful nation? Will they be able to overcome the nations that are already controlling the land of the Levant? And what gives the Israelites the right to conquer this land? And then finally, will God defend the Israelites from future threats? So now, the answers to all of these questions are quite complicated. Israel's history will move in stages, and with each new stage, the amount of control the Israelites will exert over the land will fluctuate. In the first stage, it can be summarized by an uneasy coexistence with the pagan inhabitants of the culture. Simply put, Abraham will journey to the Levant, but he will only move and work in areas that we would call steppe zones or marginal zones, the Negev, and other areas to the south of Judah's central ridge. And you may be asking, well, why does he do this? After all, God is giving him this whole land. Shouldn't he be living the good life as a settled farmer in some promising alluvial valleys like the Jezreel Valley? Why is he living as a Bedouin wanderer in a marginal zone when God has promised him this land? Well, scholars and theologians have initially offered two basic answers to this question. The first is that Abraham and his family, while they are growing rich and powerful, they simply cannot compete with the Canaanites on a military level yet. And this may explain why Jacob very fearfully reprimands his children in Genesis 34:30 when they sack a single Canaanite city. They may be strong enough to take one city by a ruse, but they can't fight an open pitch battle with many angry Canaanites coming after them. And the second reason scholars and theologians give is this, that God is waiting for the proper time to punish the native inhabitants of the land. And this is exactly what God is telling Abraham in Genesis 15:16, that the time for the Amorites has not yet come. Their evil has not basically reached the boiling point. And so, for the most part, during this time, Abraham and his offspring will coexist uneasily with the Canaanites. They will have to share space, frequently with Abraham getting more of the less promising areas. And when they do use land, they will often pay for its use, such as when Abraham buys the cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah. And they will frequently have to settle with diplomacy when there is a dispute over grazing territory or water usage rights, as in the case of Abimelech. So, after the patriarchal era, the Israelites will spend 400 years as slaves in Egypt. And when they emerge under the leadership of Moses, they are given numerous directives about how to go about conquering the land of the Levant. First, they're to totally destroy the pagan inhabitants of the land. Second, they're to divide the land fairly among the 12 tribes of Israel. And lastly, they're supposed to exist as a theocracy, meaning that they would have no king, and that God would rule them directly through his appointed emissaries, either prophets or judges. Now, under the leadership of Joshua, this plan has been reported to be carried out well, but not entirely finished. The Canaanites are not pushed out of very pivotal areas, such as the Jezreel Valley, the plain of Acco, and the Philistine plain. And what this will mean is that throughout the time of the judges, this will be contested areas, and these people groups will fight back frequently. Now, the Bible goes out of its way to explain over and over again that this conquest was not as successful as it should have been, and the reason is this: sin and the consistent breaking of God's covenant. The Bible shows that this is a very blatant cause and effect relationship, that sinful conditions in Israel always equal the inability for the Israelites to control the land. And this is among the many curses for disobedience that we read in Deuteronomy 28:29-33. Quote, "You will not succeed in anything you do. You will be constantly oppressed and constantly robbed, and there will be no one to save you. You will be engaged to a woman, and another man will rape her. You will build a house, and you won't live in it. You will plant a vineyard, and you won't even begin to use it. Your ox will be slaughtered before your eyes, and you won't get to eat it. Your donkey will be stolen from you, and you'll have to watch, and it won't be returned to you. Your flocks of sheep will be given to your enemies, and there will be no one to save you. Your sons and your daughters will be given to other people, and you will look in vain all day, and you will be powerless to do anything about it. As for the produce of your land and all your labor, you will not know, people you do not know will consume it, and you will be nothing but oppressed and crushed for the rest of your lives." i.e., the reward for sin in the Old Testament is inability to control the land. Other people will invade, other people will conquer, other people will take what they want. So that was the period of Joshua and the judges, a period of warfare between the Israelites and the local people groups, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and even the Philistines. But with the rise of David to power, most of these groups will become subdued, but they won't be exterminated either. For example, in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have a heavy focus on Saul and David's wars with the Philistines. But after this period, these local people groups are not a serious threat to Israelite independence. But in place of local threats, we start to see the rise of international threats. The Syrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians will all start causing trouble for the northern and southern Israelite kingdoms during this monarchical era. So, in one regard, Israel will finally get control of the Promised Land. But the stability will be tenuous, just like in the previous age. And again, this stability is always dependent on God's protection. And this is in turn dependent on the people's obedience to the covenant. Now, as with the period of Judges, the Bible reports over and over again that Israel's consistent sin problems during this period are the major reason why foreign nations begin conquering. Systematically, God raised up people to oppress the Israelites and eventually destroy both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. In 2 Kings 17, the reports of the destruction of the northern kingdom read this way, quote, "This happened because the Israelites sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and freed them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods. They observed the practices of the nation whom the Lord had driven out before Israel, and they followed the example of the kings of Israel. The Israelites said things about the Lord their God that were not right. They built high places in all their cities, from the watchtower to the fortresses. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense on all the high places, just like the nations whom the Lord had driven away from before them. These evil practices made the Lord very angry. They worshiped the disgusting idols in blatant disregard to the Lord's command." Unquote. So now, you may be starting to ask yourself, so what does all of this idea of land acquisition and sin and idol worship have to do with food production? Well, the simple answer is fertility. The majority of the false gods that the Israelites worshipped were usually tied to fertility cults. In Canaan, they have Baal and Asherah. In Babylon, they had Tammuz and Ishtar. In Egypt, they had Isis and Osiris. All of these gods were believed to bring about healthy cycles of agriculture and childbirth. And at the core of Israel's sin problem is this basic question: do I trust God to provide me for my basic needs of sustenance? Or will I try to hedge my bets by soliciting other gods as well? Well, I can say this: if there's any good result of the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, it was that this exilic period successfully beat this idolatrous impulse out of the Jewish people. Those who came back to the land in 539 BC came back 100% dedicated to the worship of Yahweh alone, and to monotheism, this belief in the existence of only one God. And this will be the Orthodox majority view of the Israelites from this point forward. However, when the Israelites come back to the land, they don't come back as conquerors. They come back as subjects of a larger world empire, the Persians. And this raised many fundamental theological questions for them. Questions such as, well, how is God going to fulfill this promise to Abraham that his descendants will control the land? They would also ask questions like, well, how is God going to fulfill his promise to David that one of his descendants will reign on the throne of Israel forever? Well, as Christians, we understand that the answer to both these questions is wrapped up in the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah. But from the period of 539 BC all the way until about 30 AD, these questions will have no lasting answer, and Jewish control over the land is going to be tenuous at best. All right. So I promised you food, so let's talk about diet and the people in the Bible. If you grew up getting a public school education like I did, you might remember this idea of the food pyramid, which said some pretty ridiculous things, but probably the most memorable was this idea that you had to have 6 to 9 servings of bread, 2 to 4 servings of fruit, 2 to 4 more servings of vegetables, 2 to 4 servings of dairy, and 2 to 4 servings of meat, and that's your daily consumption. Well, simply put, if you had told this to a person in biblical times, even a filthy rich person, they would have found this hard to believe and probably would have laughed at you. For the average person living in the Levant, the bulk of their food would have come from breads and grains, which could have then been further supplemented by fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. Things like meats, poultry, fish, lamb, and beef, these would be reserved for very special occasions, usually when the community was sharing a common meal and an animal had been sacrificed as part of a fellowship offering. So, for the next few slides here, we're going to specifically talk about the foods that appear on the pages of the biblical text. Now, we can't talk about all of them, so I'm going to go ahead and hedge this discussion from the onset. And what we're going to do is we're only going to talk about the staple foods that appear frequently in the biblical text. Specifically, all the foods we're going to discuss occur 30 times or more throughout the biblical text. So let's begin here at the bottom of the pyramid and talk about foods that appear in the bread food group. And easily the most common grain product we see described in the Bible is barley. Barley was often called seorah in the Old Testament, and it served as the primary food base for the poor classes of people. And this is opposed to wheat, which seems to be more costly. Now, the reason for this lower value of barley can be traced to simple supply and demand restrictions. Barley can grow in poorer soils, and it ripens faster than other grains, simply making it more plentiful and therefore less profitable. Also, barley is a much more coarse grain, and the flour that comes from it tends to be more lumpy, grainy, and the bread that comes from it tends to have similar properties. Now, typically, barley is planted just after the rainy season in the Levant, sometime in late November, and it is usually ready for harvest in late April or early May. Now, the uses for barley are numerous in the Bible. It could be reaped and fed directly to horses or other livestock. It could be ground up and processed into bread. This grain will also play a significant role in many of the Bible narratives. For example, in the Old Testament, the courting of Boaz and Ruth took place over the barley harvest. In the New Testament, a boy loaned Jesus 2 loaves of barley bread, which Jesus miraculously turned and multiplied so that it could feed 5,000 people. Furthermore, barley could be ground into a mash and fermented into beer. This product is frequently called shikar, or strong drink, in most of your translations of the Old Testament. So then, less common and more expensive than barley is another grain known as wheat. This grain took a lot longer to grow, and it required a better quality of soil in order to thrive. And the result is that wheat and the fine flour that could be produced from it was a much more precious commodity in the ancient Near East. Now, like barley, wheat could be turned into a smorgasbord of other products: bread, animal feed, and even beer. And just kind of as an interesting little side note, the Hebrew word for wheat, hitah, has been mistranslated as corn in the King James Version. And as best we can tell, corn was never grown in the Levant during the biblical period. But this rumor still persists in some circles thanks to this faulty translation by the King James Version. So just kind of keep in mind, wheat is a very common grain in the ancient Near East. Corn was not. But wheat was more expensive than barley. Okay, so there you go. You've got your wheat, you've got your barley, and with all luck, you've got the whole thing harvested by the beginning of June. So what do you do with it? Well, the first step in that process is to thresh the grain out and separate it from the chaff. And this process involved using a long fork-like implement and tossing the beaten wheat or barley into the air. The wind would then blow the lighter weight chaff away, and the heavier grains from the wheat would then fall back down directly to the ground. Once this happened, the grains could be gathered, while the chaff could then be collected as well, and then be used for either animal fodder, feeding animals, or fuel. You could burn it. Now, once the grain was collected, you needed to ground it into flour, and you did this by crushing it. And this was often done with the help of millstones. And as we saw in an earlier lecture, large millstones were often made of limestone or basalt, and they could be easily rolled on top of the grain to grind it into a fine powder. Now, at this stage of the game, you could either bake your flour into bread, and if you added yeast to this concoction, also known as hamatz, the bread would rise, creating what was called lehem, or leavened bread. However, if you didn't add yeast to the flour, the bread would remain flat, and this kind of bread was known as matzah. Of course, you could also take the bread, mash it, and add water, and then leave it to ferment. And in this process, you would create a product known as shikar. Now, some translations identify this product as strong drink, and this often invokes the concept of a hard liquor like whiskey. But this kind of a distilling process to make a potent drink like whiskey is not very well attested in the archaeological record. And this is why most modern translations tend to interpret this word nowadays as beer, because we know for a fact that beer was widely drank in both the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, according to the archaeological records. Now, I gotta admit, most Old Testament references to this drink are negative. And while beer is not directly mentioned in the New Testament, the practice of drunkenness is strictly forbidden, at least according to 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. But with all of that being said, there are a few positive references to this product. And probably the most controversial is Deuteronomy 14:26, which allows a worshiper to even spend part of their tithe money on beer that may be consumed at the feast following the fellowship offering. That's right, you could buy beer and then worship the Lord with it. Well, passages like this are often surprising to us evangelicals these days, and this is largely because in the past we have turned against the consumption of alcohol, and this has been a trend for almost 200 years. So, I would like to stress, though, that this idea of alcoholic prohibition is not the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview stressed moderation and not prohibition, at least with regard to the consumption of alcoholic drinks. So, that was the bread food group. Let's go up to the next rung on the pyramid and check out the fruits and vegetables group. Well, it's more of the vegetables group, because just a simple matter of fact, while vegetables like onions, leeks, and dill are mentioned in the Bible, they're not mentioned with a high degree of frequency. And this is why we're largely going to focus on fruits in this lecture, because fruits come up much, much more consistently in the Bible than vegetables do. So, the first major fruit we need to discuss is olives, or zavit. This is a tree that grows in both steppe and Mediterranean zones, and if you cultivate it responsibly, olive trees can grow for over 1,000 years, and they'll produce a healthy crop year after year after year. Now, to gather olives from your olive tree, a farmer would need to beat the branches with a long stick, and this process would cause the ripe fruits to fall to the ground, where they could then be gathered and collected into containers. Now, I gotta stress this, an olive grove is a long-term investment. You don't just plant an olive tree and the next year you're going to have olives. In fact, it could take well over 40 years after planting an olive tree before you produced a fully healthy crop of olives. And in the meantime, an olive tree required nearly constant maintenance. And so, while this is a very long-term investment, the ancients obviously thought it was worth it, because things like olive oil, or shaman, the product that could be made from a cultivated olive tree, was used in numerous things throughout the ancient world. In fact, olive oil could probably use the same catchphrase as Frank's Red Hot Sauce uses today. We put that stuff on everything. For cooking purposes, olive oil could be mixed into flour, it could be baked into the bread, it could be heated to deep fry food, it could be even applied to vegetables and other things as a dressing. And that's just the dietary uses. It could also be used as fuel. The olive oil could be burned, and it was the primary lighting fluid used in lamps and torches. Now, if that wasn't enough, olive oil was also used for hygienic and medical uses. So you could use olive oil for bathing, washing your hair, dressing a wound, and even disinfecting a surface. So in short, olive oil was used on a nearly daily basis. And when your oil was running low, it was often a sign of famine, poverty, or both. Now, to make olive oil, ripe olives are pressed, and the oil is then channeled into a basin where it can be collected. And you can do this process twice. You can actually take a mashed olive, heat it up, and then repress it to create a less potent form of oil that can usually be used for burning as a fuel in lamps. Now, the olive harvest often began in late August, and then this meant that the family would need to collect its year's supply of oil there at the end of summer when it was most readily available. Now, the next major fruit of the Levant that we want to discuss is grapes, or anavim, as the Hebrews called it. This is a fruit that grows on vines, and more frequently, grapes are referred to in the biblical text by this euphemism, the fruit of the vine. So, like olives, grape harvest comes once a year, and it comes in early September. And so the window for harvesting grapes is often shorter in dry climates. And so this made the grape trade very lucrative, but it was also not unheard of for vintners to build walls and watchtowers around their property so that they could keep a close eye on their produce, especially as September was coming and people would be tempted to rob them of their produce. Now, a person could eat the grapes directly off the vine, but I gotta say that this was probably not the most common way to eat your grapes. The two most common products you would make from grapes are raisins and wine. Now, raisins are important because if you dry the grape out in the sun, it can be stored well into the fall into the winter months. Now, the other storage method is to turn it into wine, or yain. And, well, let's just say the liquid that is produced by smashing of grapes has had a long and storied history that we're probably going to need to discuss for a while. So, like beer, wine consumption in the Bible offers a complication to most modern evangelical sensibilities. And this has led to a whole host of eisegetical theories that I hear frequently from Christians. They'll say things like, well, Jesus only used non-fermented grape juice. Or they'll say, that wine was really diluted to keep its potency to a minimum. You would have had to drink tons of the stuff to even get drunk. Well, these statements are bandied about frequently, but to be honest, they are the product of sanctified evangelical musing. And they're not really directly related to the actual reality or the archaeological record, or the biblical accounts, to be honest. In short, alcoholic wine was a reality of the biblical world, and we would do well to stop reading our own cultural values into the biblical text. So here's my argument for why this is true. For starters, wine naturally ferments on its own. You can make it stronger by adding more yeast to the fermenting process, but if you just leave it alone in a cask or a wineskin without adding any yeast, it will ferment on its own. It will turn alcoholic without any help whatsoever. And the only way to stop this fermenting process is to either A, drink it quickly, or to pasteurize it. And let's be honest, the process of grape juice pasteurization wasn't invented until Welsh's mastered it in 1859. So, secondly, there are just way too many warnings about the overconsumption of wine in both the New and the Old Testaments. And to me, this suggests that the majority of the wine being produced is of the non-alcoholic variety. You don't need to put a warning label on something nobody's using. And lastly, the abuse of alcohol is prohibited in Scripture, not the use of alcohol. And it is highly likely that for major Bible passages, such as John 2, 1 through 12, where Jesus turns water into wine, what is being described here is a very high quality and potent alcoholic wine. And this is the most likely interpretation we're seeing from respected biblical scholars nowadays. So, that's my soapbox for the day. Don't abuse alcohol, but also don't rip your brothers and sisters in Christ for a casual drink either. So, back to the task at hand. How do you process this? How do you make wine? Well, let's start with the basics. First, the grapes need to be pressed. And this can be accomplished by either stomping the grapes with your feet or by pressing them in a wine press, very similar to an olive press that we saw a few slides back. Now, most sites in the Levant have very large wine presses near their vineyards, and these wine presses can be several yards in diameter. And this could be, and simply put, these could be used for processing thousands of gallons of wine at a time. Now, once you've got it stomped, you then need to have the juice stored somewhere. And the most common way to store wine was to put it in a wineskin. Now, these were bags that were often made out of animal intestine. And as the wine fermented, it would release carbon dioxide and the bag would expand. And this is why Jesus, when he gave the parable of the wineskins, he says, don't put new wine in an old wineskin. Because if that skin had already been used once, it's already expanded probably to its maximum potential. And then if you put something new in it that's just going to expand even more, it'll probably bust open. So, once you've got it to that point, what comes next? Well, you wait. The fermenting process can be as short as a few weeks, or it can be prolonged to take months, depending on how strong you want your drink. Okay, so with grapes and wine out of the way, let's move on to a less controversial fruit. Let's move on to figs, or tenna. This is another popular fruit of the Levant, and numerous products such as fig cakes and other soft pastries can be made from the fruit of a ripe fig. Well, several different varieties of fig trees exist in in the Levant, but by far the most common type of fig tree mentioned in the Bible is the sycamore tree. For example, Zacchaeus climbed up one of these in the book of Luke so that he could get a better view of Jesus as he traveled through Jericho. Amos, the herdsman prophet, claimed to be a gardener who specialized in the care of fig trees, according to Amos 7:14. And even Jesus notoriously cursed the fig tree for not bearing fruit, even though it was still about 2 months early for ripe figs to be on the branch. See Mark 11:13. And so these are your major fruit staples of the Levant. Other fruits such as pomegranates and various nuts are common in the Levant, but they're just not popular in the biblical text. They don't pass our 30 times or more criteria. Okie dokie, so going up one more step in the food pyramid, now we're ready to get to dairy products. And I should probably begin by stating that dairy products made up the bulk of the food consumption of the Israelites' diet during fall and winter months. As Proverbs 27:25-27 notes, once the grains have been retired for the year and the seasonal grasses begin to grow, then it's time to start relying on renewable resources of animal products for things like wool and goat's milk, or as the Hebrews called it, halav. And this is why dairy was dairy was so much more common than meat consumption in the Levant during the biblical age. A slaughtered animal could really only be eaten once. And since they lived in a world without refrigeration, you really couldn't keep it for weeks at a time. Once the animal is slaughtered, you eat it, lasts a couple days, it's gone. Dairy products, though, could be continually produced from all of the mammals of the flock, sheep, goats, cattle, and as long as you were able to feed these mother animals with grass and keep them well fed, a lactating animal could produce milk indefinitely. And so the basis for all dairy products, all of this begins with milk. And from there, it can be turned into cream, butter, sour cream, and of course, cottage cheese. You see, another advantage of dairy over meat is that when it begins to go bad, it can still be salvaged and transformed into other products. Cottage cheese, or hemna, was frequently consumed in the biblical text. Abraham offered it to his 3 divine guests in Genesis 18:7-8. Isaiah predicts the child that will be born of a virgin will have a diet of curds when he is young. See Isaiah 7:15. And even David accepted a gift of cottage cheese from Hushai when they were escaping from David's son Absalom. So from there, cottage cheese can further be processed. You can either turn it into cream cheese, yogurt, and of course, just plain cheese. Well, the technical word for this kind of cheese is known as shefot. But it's really hard to say exactly what type of dairy product this is when this word is getting used in the Bible. Modern translations have called this stuff anything from butter to sour cream to just cheese. And the take-home point here is that dairy products were numerous and well attested to in the Bible. They were replenishable so long as you could keep your cows or your sheep or your goats very well fed. And when they started to go bad, you could frequently turn them into other dairy products, ensuring that they didn't go to waste all that quickly. And because of these realities, many Israelites own animals solely for the purpose of supplementing their diets with dairy products. And this was especially true during the winter months, when it was not at all uncommon for the entire Israelite diet to consist mostly of dairy. Well, I hope they didn't become lactose intolerant, I guess. Alright, so moving up, let's go to the top of the Mediterranean food pyramid, where we find meats. Now, our slide a few clicks back indicated that meat was not a daily or even a weekly occurrence in a Mediterranean diet. And frequently, the consumption of meat was saved for very special festival holidays such as Passover, First Fruits, Pentecost. And we'll discuss all of these festivals individually and at a greater depth at a later lecture. But for now, let's just say that when it came to meat, the Israelites made a distinction between clean and unclean animals. Not just any animal could be turned into a nice meaty meal. To be a clean animal, it had to eat grass, and it had to have a split hoof. At least that's for a land-based animal to be clean. And this meant that animals such as pigs, camels, and rabbits were all disqualified because either A, they didn't have the split hoof, or B, they didn't eat grass. And this meant that the two most common types of animals consumed in the Bible for meat are cows and sheep-goats, or sown. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why did I just separate these two animals into a singular term? Well, the Hebrew word for the flock animal, the sown, can be easily applied to both a sheep or a goat. And quite frankly, it'll make this lecture a lot shorter if I just combine the terms. So bear with me. Now, when it comes to special occasions where meat is consumed, the Israelites were not above going all out when it came to these kind of festivals. For example, in 1 Kings 8, verse 63, it records that Solomon offered a peace offering, meaning an offering that could be eaten by the people, and he offered 22,000 cows and 120,000 sheep when he dedicated the temple. That's a lot of meat, folks. So, while we're on the subject, let's bring up that interesting term that we see again and again in the Old Testament, the shalamim, or the peace offering. And this was different from the whole burnt offering in that once the sacrifice was made, it was meant to be eaten by the people who made the sacrifice. That's right, there were some sacrifices where you sacrificed your animal and you instantly got it back to eat it. Now, once an offering had been made to atone for the sins of a worshiper, the worshiper was free to offer any clean animal they wanted as a peace offering, or often it's translated as fellowship offering. And when this happened, the animal that was sacrificed is cooked. Once it's prepared, the family and the worshiper will all be invited to gather around and eat the food along with the priest or the Levite who performed the sacrifice itself. Now, if you sacrificed a large animal like a bull, or if just numerous worshipers were coming that day and bringing their offering, this could become a time for a community-wide meal. And what is important about all this is that this took place after the sin offering had been made. And so when the people dined on the peace offering, they did so understanding that they had a restored relationship with God thanks to the sin offering. And now that they were eating the fellowship offering, they weren't just sharing it with their fellow Israelites. They were also eating in the presence of the Lord himself. But now, cattle and goats are not the only meats that are on the menu here. Seafood was also permitted as a kosher part of the diet so long as it had scales and fins, i.e. the classic definition of a fish. Now, sadly, this does leave out such seafood as lobsters, crab, and other shellfish. And I guess at this point I should probably point out that fish almost didn't make this list. It doesn't occur 30 times in the Old Testament, but if you're familiar with the New Testament, you know that the accounts regularly show Jesus and his disciples eating fish, or dag. In the New Testament, it's called ichthus. But like dairy products, you could farm for fish and consume fish year-round, so long as you had a healthy fishing industry that was willing to go out and catch the fish on a daily basis. And so what this will mean is that fish consumption will be a major part of the diet in areas around the coastal plains and around the Sea of Galilee, but it will be a lot more rare, especially when you move into steppe and desert zones. Well, we're finally at the end of our journey up the food period, and it just wouldn't be right if we didn't end with just a little bit of junk food. Well, needless to say, the Hershey bar had not been invented during the biblical era, so things that would satisfy the sweet tooth of our biblical writers and our characters in the biblical stories usually had to revolve around naturally occurring products. And by far, the most popular junk food in the Bible is honey. And, of course, you probably know this, but I'll humor you anyway. Honey is a secretion that is made from bees. Bees gather pollen and nectar from flowering plants. The bee eats this pollen and nectar, and then it regurgitates it into a honeycomb in the form of honey. And so long as you can remove the bees and their larvae from the honeycomb, the comb itself is actually quite edible. And numerous Bible characters, from Jonathan, the son of Saul, to Samson, will be recorded eating honey in this way, just simply grabbing some honeycomb and putting it in their mouth. Now, additionally, honey also appeared to be a major staple of John the Baptist's diet while he was living in the wilderness of Judea out by the Jordan River. Now, like a lot of our fruits and vegetables, bees also go dormant during the fall and winter months. There's just not flowering plants for them to feed off of. So even in the Levant, honey production is also often limited to spring and summer months. However, honey naturally repels microbes. It doesn't have a lot of water in it. And so honey can be stored for very long periods of time. The only catch is the smell of honey will frequently attract critters and other bugs, and so you have to find a way to seal it in order to keep it from getting infested. So there, that was the skinny on biblical food production. But there's also another side to that coin there. Famine. The Hebrew word for famine is ra'av, and it occurs over 120 times in the Old Testament. And to me, this indicates that famines are frequent, at least frequent enough that the Israelite people worried about them a lot. And you may be asking, well, why did famines occur? Well, the answer to this question is both pragmatic and theological. The pragmatic answer is simplest. When storms failed to materialize over the Mediterranean Sea, droughts and eventually famines were the result. But that's a very simplistic answer. The theological answer, the answer the Bible is most interested in, is a lot more complex, and we'll need to deal with a subject known as casuistic law in order to demonstrate this. Simply put, many of the laws of the Old Testament are based on cause and effect, hence the name casuistic law. Frequently, as we saw in the blessings and the curses section of Deuteronomy, the rains and all of the bountiful produce of the land were dependent on the Israelites corporately obeying the law of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 17, gives us a pretty good example of this sort of cause and effect scenario. Quote, "Now, if you pay close attention to my commandments that I am giving you this day, and love the Lord your God, and you serve him with all your mind and being, he promises, quote, I will send rain to your land in its season, the autumn rains, the spring rains, so that you may gather your grain and your new wine and your olive oil, and I will provide pasture for your livestock, and you will eat your fill. But make sure that you do not turn away to serve and worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will erupt against you, and he will close up the sky so that it does not rain. The land will not yield its produce, and you will soon be removed from this good land that the Lord is giving you." Unquote. This idea of casuistic law constituted the Israelite paradigm of famine. Frequently, when the prophets such as Joel were calling the people of Israel to repentance, they began by noting that the land was experiencing a famine, a drought, a plague, or something else that was decimating the production of food, harming the process of fertility. And this lack of rain was often seen as undeniable proof that the Israelites were involved in some kind of unacceptable behavior. And the result was always the same. The prophets would call the people to return to the Lord their God with all their hearts, and God promised he would restore the bounty of the land. Now, it would be easy to draw the line there and call it a day, but like I said before, this is a theological answer, and there's no such thing as a simple theological answer. For example, King Solomon notes in Ecclesiastes 7:15 that sometimes the righteous die like their sinners, and sometimes the sinners have long and productive lives. And what he's getting at there is, just simply put, sometimes sinners enjoy quite a lot of fertility and productivity, and sometimes the righteous don't. And this is a paradox to casuistic law. And in the teachings of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, he's even more straightforward when he points out that God the Father sends rains on both the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus pretty much just lays it out and says, you know what? The God we worship sends rains on them both. And you know what? Sometimes he doesn't make the distinction. And this is the basic problem of trying to apply casuistic law to modern day events. When a tragedy or a famine strikes, can this be seen as an indication of God's displeasure with a particular people group? Well, maybe, but it's also very presumptuous to say that it is with 100% certainty. And just for an example, when Jesus is walking with his disciples in John chapter 9, they ask him when they see a blind man, who sinned, this man or his parents? They're asking a question of casuistic law. Who sinned so that this man is now blind? Jesus answered them, neither. In some cases, casuistic law simply doesn't play out. And so the bottom line for this whole idea is that while casuistic law is vitally important to understanding the orthodox worldview of the Israelites, success or failure in agriculture or economy or society cannot be used today to assess whether God is approving or disapproving of what a culture is doing with 100% accuracy. So that was the Israelite worldview. But now let's shift gears and let's talk about Israel's pagan neighbors and their ideas that they had about famine and fertility. Now for this part of the lecture, my basic thesis is going to be this, that the biblical authors were very, very aware of the false beliefs of the pagans. And frequently they sought to combat these ideas, especially when they started to see that these ideas were becoming commonplace among the people of Israel and Judah. Now, I should probably begin by stating that up until recently, most scholars didn't know all that much about Canaanite religion, save for what we could figure out about Canaanite religion by reading the Bible. However, starting in the late 1800s and continuing all the way up until the present, Canaanite and Philistine cities have been excavated, particularly cities like Ashkelon and Ugarit. And as they've been excavated, archaeologists are discovering numerous tablets and texts that help us to fill in the gaps of what Canaanite religion was like, and in very great detail, to be honest. And of all of the finds, probably the most important is the Phoenician city of Ugarit, because in this particular city, they have a language, also known as Ugaritic, and Bible scholars have noted that this Canaanite language is very similar to the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And the result of all of this comparative study between Ugaritic and Hebrew is that we often get fresh and deeper readings of Old Testament text. And so at the end of our third lecture this week, I'll try to demonstrate this for you by exegeting the Elijah versus the prophets of Baal passage from 1 Kings chapter 18. So let's talk about the Canaanite worldview by noting that the Canaanites had some weird ideas, but they weren't dummies either. They were very well aware of how the cycle of seasons was supposed to work. You get your rain in the winter and spring months, and you get dry conditions in the summer and in the fall months. However, they were not simply content to just note this as a natural phenomenon. As your Walton textbook points out, the ancients didn't have a worldview that made a clear distinction between the secular and the sacred. Everything in the ancient world had a divine cause, and the Canaanites believed that this cycle was no exception. So, for the Canaanites, their theological reason for this cycle of seasons was wrapped up in the actions of the storm god, known as Baal or Baal, and his consort, Asherah. Now, during the dry months that they experienced few to no rainstorms, the Canaanites believed that Baal was killed by the god of death, Mot. And they also believed that Mot then took Baal's corpse down into the underworld, keeping him there, and this facilitated the dry season. And it became a season of heat and withering. Why? Because the storm god who brings fertility and rain was dead. However, with the coming of the winter rains, it was believed that Baal's consort, Asherah, was traveling to the underworld and was grabbing Baal and resurrecting him. And with Baal's return to life, he and his consort would, they'd be doing what they would normally be doing, which is having sexual intercourse. And this belief that they were copulating produced the result that fertility and rainfall would come in the spring and the winter months. And this whole process in Canaanite religion is known as the Baal cycle. And for as silly as it might sound for us today, this was the dominant worldview of the pagan cultures surrounding Israel during the Old Testament era. So now you may be asking, how does this idea help me to read the biblical text better? Well, since the Israelites were monotheists, or at least they should have been, their God, Yahweh, doesn't have a consort. He doesn't have a female counterpart. However, both the Bible and the archaeological evidence do confirm that many Israelites did build Asherah shrines, even in places of Yahweh worship. For example, in 2 Kings 21:7, the evil king Manasseh even went so far as to build an Asherah pole in the temple of the Lord itself, right there in Jerusalem. Now, we might be inclined to ask, well, why did they do this? Well, the simple answer is because, despite the warnings from the prophets, the people seem to be finding this polytheistic worldview quite compelling. They seem to be willing to hedge their bets. Maybe if Yahweh doesn't help, maybe some of these other gods will. And in particular, these people and their folk religion seem to have a need for Yahweh to have a wife to have intercourse with, in order to ensure fertility. And this process is known as syncretism, where you blend two religions together and you form a new religion. And this is the biblical testimony of exactly what happened, and happened with alarming frequency. Frequency enough that God eventually punished the Israelites and he deported them into exile. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that there's a very specific reason here. It has become quite commonplace for archaeologists and many liberal biblical scholars to publish books and papers that will ask questions, provocative questions like, did God ever have a wife? And it's become quite common for conservatives to just blast these ideas very uncritically. And the result is we really haven't been having a good dialogue, a good critical dialogue on this subject for a while. So now that you know all of this about the Baal cycle, and you also know what the biblical text says, you're able to respond in a more critical way to this question. Did Yahweh have a wife? Well, the Bible says that many Israelites certainly believed that he did. And also, the Bible's testimony is they were wrong for doing this. And this is where the dialogue must begin. It must begin with the affirmation that syncretism and idolatry were indeed common in Iron Age Israelite worship, and that both the Bible and the archaeological record confirm this as much. It is simply the testimony of the Bible that this was a bad thing, not that it wasn't happening. So now, in conjunction with these Canaanite fertility cults, two major moral problems also sprang up, and those are adultery and murder. You may remember me telling you a few slides back how Baal and his consort were believed to be having sexual intercourse, and that this was supposed to bring rains and fertility and prosperity. Well, what do you do when you worship a god like this? How do you worship gods like this? Well, simply put, you have to encourage them to have sex often if you want the land to be fertile. And so the Canaanite answer is to have ritual sex, or sex magic. And often priests, priestesses, and especially trained cultic prostitutes, who could be both male or female, would engage in ritual sex acts, and this was supposed to mirror the divine couple and the sex that they were having. Now, this is often known as sympathetic magic, where a ritual is performed on earth and it's believed to have an effect up in the heavenly realms. And as your Walton textbook pointed out, one of the major differences between the pagan and the Orthodox Israelite worldview is that the Israelites did not believe that Yahweh could be influenced by sympathetic magic, while the pagans not only believed it, but they also thought that sympathetic magic was stronger than the gods themselves. And the result of all this is that many of the depraved sexual acts that we see listed in the Bible are blasted by the biblical prophets. And just about every prophet, New or Old Testament, from Isaiah to Paul, had some very choice words about what they thought about these sex magic practices. And across the board, it is a condemnation of these ideas. But now, on to the second problem of fertility cults: murder. You may also remember that in this Canaanite worldview, the god of death, Mot, kills Baal every year. Well, what happens when there's a famine? When the rains do not come back at their proper time? Well, the Canaanite theological answer was that the god Mot was somehow keeping Baal from rising from the dead, and therefore needed to somehow be satisfied or placated. And this is where the act of human sacrifice comes into play. And it was hoped by the Canaanites that the god of death would accept a human sacrifice or multiple sacrifices in order that he would release Baal from his captivity in the underworld. And you can see how this kind of belief could turn out to be quite insidious. If you honestly believe that the only way for you and your entire community not to starve to death was for one of your number to be sacrificed, well, you'd be willing eventually to deal with the loss of one or even a few people if it meant that the rest of the community could be spared. And one thing we notice is that many of the idols of these death gods across these cultures of, whether it be the Canaanites, the Moabites, many of these idols are constructed as furnaces so that humans, and especially children, could be burned or cooked once you heated this idol up to a red-hot temperature. Now, like the sex magic cult, human sacrifice was strictly prohibited in the Old Testament, and the practice is always condemned with the words that it's detestable. So, however, though, the idea is not entirely without its merit. I mean, after all, as Christians, we do believe that our sins are covered and atoned for simply because God has sent his own Son to die as a sacrifice in our place so that we might have eternal life. So as with most bad pagan ideas, there's usually a certain grain of truth, and the issue of human sacrifice is no exception. The question is, for us, what constitutes a perfect sacrifice? And, of course, the Christian answer has always been that we are saved by the blood of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. Alrighty, so let's finish out this whole yummy and then disturbing lecture with some final points to take home. First, I want you to know that the Mediterranean diet of the people of the Bible was a carbohydrate-heavy diet, filled mostly with grains and fruits during the spring and summer months, and then filled with milk and other dairy products for the winter months. Secondly, know that the Israelite worldview trusted in God to provide fertility, and that this fertility came without the use of human sacrifice or sex magic. And instead, if the Israelites wanted to ensure that the bounty of the land was maintained, they had to maintain obedience to the law of Moses. And lastly, I want you to know that the Canaanite beliefs show an inherent lack of trust in the reliability of their gods. They had to be helped out by having sex magic, essentially showing the divine couple how it's done. Or the gods of death had to be appeased with human sacrifice in order to let fertility return. And in both of these issues, we see a demonstration that Canaanite deities are fickle and morally flawed. And when the deities are flawed morally, the result is always that the people who worship them become flawed morally. So, That about wraps it up. Thank you very much for your time. We'll see you again soon, and God bless you, my friends. Have a wonderful day.